Welcome to Stories from the Break Room, where the real stories of work come to life.
Hello, and welcome to Stories from the Break Room, the podcast. I am Nora Burns, and I will be your host and your guide on this adventure. And I am so thankful that you're here. Now, if you've listened to previous episodes, you know that the content for this podcast is driven by stories that come in from American workers across the country, across the organizational chart, and across a wide variety of industries. Now, the call continues to go out for stories. The more stories we have, the richer stories we have about the great, the good, the bad, and the ugly about what's happening in the American workforce today, the stronger this podcast will be. Now, we have upcoming episodes planned having to do with wage and hour issues, having to do with tipped employees who are talking about, wait, what is with this distribution of wages, with people talking about hours and clocking in, clocking out, what they should or should not be paid for related to that, and some elements of a loss prevention in the retail environment and how employees feel about some of those processes and policies. So we've got some themes that are coming up, but if you have stories from the American workforce, I welcome you to submit them either online at storiesfromthebreakroom.com or by calling our telephone line to leave a voicemail recording with your story at 719-886. I forgot our number for a second there, at 6672. That's 719-886-6672. Your stories drive the content for this show. Now, today's topic is a little heavier. I want to give you a heads up about that in the event that you are listening to this podcast within earshot of children. This episode is going to go into some heavy topics that might not be suitable for children to hear. So please put on those headphones or put in the earpods or maybe listen to this at a later time. Also, if you are emotionally not in a position to talk about big traumas in life, this is probably not the podcast for you to listen to right now. So that's our topic is a little heavy. So wanted to give you a little warning so that you knew to avoid it if it wasn't the right fit for you today. Now, one of the stories that came in recently is very timely and relevant to things going on in the world today, and I wanted to make sure that we talked about it. For those of you who may not know, I record out of Denver, Colorado. And Colorado has an unfortunate history in that on April 20th of 1999, Columbine High School was impacted by the worst school shooting to date at that time. Unfortunately, there have been more serious or greater loss of life in school shootings since, but that had not been the case on April 20th of 1999, when two students of Columbine High School murdered 12 students and one teacher and injured countless others. And they ultimately committed suicide at the site of Columbine High School. So you'll hear it referred to as Columbine most often, but the people who were killed were between the ages of 14 years old and 47 years old. Now, there are a lot of people who were impacted by this event, not only within the Colorado community outreaching from there, but schools across the country reacted and were impacted just by the threat that this created. It's an important date to recognize and commemorate, and this year marks 25 years since that event. I tell you all of this because the letter that we're going to talk about today at the top of this podcast is about Columbine. So I wanted to provide that background for those of you who might not be familiar with the massacre that happened at Columbine High School here in Colorado on April 20th of 1999. Here's the story that was submitted. I am a Columbine survivor. This year marks 25 years since that horrific day. I asked for the day off well in advance of April 20th, and my boss refused. I have never been less productive at work. My mind was absolutely elsewhere with the friends that I had lost and with the friends who had gathered together that day while I was at work to commemorate the date. I was feeling exhausted and anxious all day. And this is why I will be looking for another job. Now, I'm hoping if you are a leader or a manager in an organization, as I read that story, you hopefully thought, no. Like that person needs this day off. We need to find a way to make that happen. Quite frankly, I'm surprised they didn't just call in sick. I think that's what most employees would have done in this particular situation. And then you would have been in an even bigger challenge in terms of managing the work that needed to get done. But this employee wasn't productive that day. This is dealing with a significant trauma. And yes, it's been 25 years and probably hundreds of hours of therapy to process and go through all of that. But when you are witness to that type of an event, you're party to that type of an event, you are within that circle of the people who are directly impacted, the students, the teachers, the first responders, all the therapists that came in to help, the parents, like that day will have significance forever. And it will be a heavy day forever. So honoring and allowing this employee that time off is critical. Now, I understand. I've been an operations director, and I understand that there's juggling that has to take place with requests for time off and the commitments of the business. This one feels like one that should take priority. Now, there's never a straight line. Some of you as leaders and managers are going to say, well, it wasn't the protocol or the process. We already had 5 requests or we had whatever. We can't make an exception because then we if we set up a new expectation for employees, and I can't do that. I feel pretty good that anybody who survived a mass shooting like that gets priority. I'm okay with setting that new protocol. And I think all too often we're afraid to color a little bit outside the lines to accommodate somebody in a time of need. You've heard me say it before, and you will hear me say it again. It's an employment relationship. We remember the employment part, taxes and paperwork, benefits, all of that. All too often we forget the relationship part. The empathy, the listening, the communication, the working together that we would expect from those that we are closest to. Now, this is an example of a time when empathy should have taken hold, and it just didn't. It's going to cost this organization an employee. And employees, replacing talented employees is incredibly expensive. Going through the whole hiring and recruiting and background check and training and getting that person up to speed and the impact that it can have on everyone else in the organization, it has a pretty big ripple effect. Well, because we didn't understand what this employee needed on this day. Now, this is one example. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of others. There have been other events that have had a national impact or local impact or personal impact. Now, I think of a couple of the big ones that I have been an HR practitioner through or leader through. One that comes to mind that some of you might recall was the DC sniper attacks that happened in October of 2002. Now, this was very specifically regional. There were people that were getting shot while they were getting gas, and they didn't know where this was coming from. Eventually, they arrested and prosecuted two individuals. I believe it was a father-son, if memory serves correctly, that had been shooting out of like the trunk of a car, if I recall correctly. But it was a terrifying time to be in the greater DC area where this was taking place. And to stop and get gas felt like a risk that you were taking, never knowing kind of where they were going to strike next. Now, at the time, I was working for an organization where I had over the entire country responsibility in terms of HR at different facilities. And one of them happened to be in Manassas, Virginia. And I had a planned visit to go visit with the site leadership and some of the employees there in Manassas. And I remember my boss telling me that I could cancel that trip. Like I didn't need to go to Virginia, given what was happening. And I thanked him for the consideration for me and my well-being. But I also felt very strongly that as a leader in that organization, if I did not honor my commitment to come and see them at that facility, well, we were still expecting them to come into work every single day, would be a little hypocritical. And so I said, thank you, but I will take the accommodation of using the rental car out where you can have them you can just buy the tank from the rental car company when you rent the car and not have to fill up the gas tank. That was my accommodation for that. So I was a little bit safer. It felt a little bit safer. But the reality is our employees needed to drive to work every day. They would eventually need to get gas. And we needed to be supportive of our employees in that environment and not say, well, we're not going to do that, even though we're expecting you to, in terms of coming into work on a daily basis. I think making sure that we're being there for employees during that time is just critically important. Now, at the time we were working third-party logistics, trucking, and we actually had, you could gas up on site. It wasn't something that we did for employees. It wasn't an offer that we had, but we had a diesel for the trucks, but we also had regular gas on site. And so we found a way to accommodate those employees that wanted to buy gas from the company, even though it wasn't the norm, that we could figure out a way to do that because we had that as an opportunity that was just right there staring us in the face. But I think it's really important that we honor the fact that employees are going through stress. We talked about it. We provided support for them during that time. We provided guidance to our leaders and how do you talk with employees who are going through critical, stressful, traumatic times? Because it's not something that comes naturally to everyone. And it's an important element of how we manage that relationship and really honor the employment relationship. Now, the most significant event for those of us in the American workforce is probably 9/11. Now, some of the listeners to this actually weren't born when that event took place. Others were directly impacted. They were in Manhattan. They were in Pennsylvania, in Washington, D.C., at Boston's Logan Airport. Or had family or friends or people who were significant in our lives that were on those planes or in those areas. I am incredibly proud of how the executive team that I was working with at that time handled 9/11. We were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, doing third-party distribution, but also grocery support and operation, warehousing, trucking, manufacturing, kind of all of those things in that umbrella fell under our operation. And the president was so incredibly supportive I went in with an appeal to move all of the televisions that we had, because again, this is before everybody had an iPhone in their pocket, or an Android. And so we pushed all the televisions that were present in the entire facility, all but one. There was one that we did keep in the president's office for all the executives to go in as they were meeting and sorting through what was happening. Every other television that was present on the facility went into the break rooms and the cafeterias. The president was incredibly supportive of the messaging that I recommended that we share with employees, and also that we talked to the union stewards and we talked to them about, and the union business agents, about how we were going to manage that particular day. And we gave employees the freedom to step away from their jobs and said, we understand that this is not a normal day. We are also providing groceries and food to our communities. So we need to continue to work, but not everybody has to be fully productive today. So if you need to step away and go to the cafeteria, go to the break room, watch some coverage, use the company phones to call your friends, your family, to make sure people are okay. If you could get through on the phone line, that was a big issue that day, please do that. We had food brought into the cafeterias and the break rooms so that if people were planning to go out to lunch but wanted to stay in and watch the coverage, that they could. We did not have our normal production quotas for that day. We said that those things are just off, right? We're not gonna track that. This is an exception to the rule. Now, some of you who are operations directors and vice presidents are screaming at your podcast device now. Yes, we still need to get the food out. Yes, we still need to stock shelves of grocery stores. The reality is, in that moment, when we did not know what was happening in our country, and we did not know how many other targets might exist, it's only human to connect with those employees and say, we get it, because we also on executive row wanted to be watching the coverage and be sorting through what was happening and talking to our friends and family members to make sure that they were okay. It seems we should give all of our team members, that same opportunity in a major crisis of that kind. Now, I was incredibly impressed with how that was handled that day and that week. We did blood drives and collections and all kinds of things to really help serve during that time. And I'm incredibly proud of that time in my career. But I've heard story after story from employees across the country about employers who did not handle that day well. That was a big exceptional day, right? Like, you were caught off guard. That wasn't the norm, didn't know. But here's the thing. We know, as we sit here in 2024, that these weren't the last of these types of events to happen in our lifetimes. I know it's not easy to accept. And yet the reality is the pace of shooting incidents has increased. There's more than Columbine who have been impacted by mass shootings taking place, right? And the reality is that we as leaders and managers and organizations have to be in a position to know how to take care of employees during those crises. So I ask you for your call to action today is to talk with your organization about what is your what if plan. What would you do in the event of a major catastrophic event in your town, in your city, in your county, in your state, in the country? How will we make sure to look out for the employees and to make sure that they are cared for and that we are present while taking care of our operation? But finding that balance and knowing, having thought it through before we get to the next catastrophe is just wildly important. It will help you in the midst of that stressful event to know what the action items are. How do we navigate that moving forward? The time to talk about how we're going to address a major catastrophic incident is not in the middle of it. It's getting a plan ahead of time so that we know how we're going to address employee situations, leadership situations, client situations, when and if something like that comes down in our neighborhoods. I hope it never does. I hope that you have a plan without ever needing to execute on it. But just like any major event, if you have kids, you probably have a plan with them as if there was a tornado or a flood or a hurricane. Where do we all meet up? How do we communicate with each other? What's the expectation of how you communicate with each other? You have a plan. If there's a tornado warning that goes off, I have a plan for how I react to that within my own household. Let's have a plan so that the stressful event, when it comes down the pike, doesn't throw us off guard. And it doesn't cost us our humanity and our empathy. Because like this person who wrote in about not getting the time to honor and respect the marking of the 25th year of Columbine, we need to be ready for when it happens in real time. And we need to be ready for how we process and help employees who've gone through it and are continuing to process those events. This was a heavy episode. This is a heavy discussion point. What I would like for you to send in to me, if while you were listening to this episode, you thought, oh, that reminds me of a manager who handled it really well, a leader who handled it really well. Maybe you're an expert at planning for catastrophic events. What tips do you have for leaders and managers and organizations to make sure that they are well prepared for significant traumatic events that happen? I'd really appreciate hearing from you. I want to hear your stories related to this topic that are great, good, bad, and ugly. My hope is that we will all do better in navigating these situations in the future. Well, my real hope is that we don't have to navigate them in the future, but that if we do, we're prepared. I'm Nora Burns. I'm so thankful that you've tuned in for this episode of Stories from the Break Room, and I look forward to connecting with you again next time. Please send in your stories. I'm listening.